Today our topic is pollination and fertilization, Unit 1.5 and 1.6. Our objectives will be, at the end of this lesson we will be able to define and describe pollination, the types of pollination, define and describe fertilization process, and to understand the structure of a seed. Definition of pollination. Pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma. The goal of every living organism, including plants, is to create offspring for the next generation. One of the ways that plants can produce offspring is by making seeds through pollination. So pollination is the process in which the pollen grains are transferred from one flower to another, or from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the other flower, or of the same flower, is called as pollination. This is the process of pollination, that pollen grains from the anther of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower through some pollinators, some vectors or some agents which are involved in this process. Those agents are called as pollinators. Pollinators may be different, like in animals there are insects, there are birds, humans and other animals. They are all used as pollinators. Pollinators, as I told you, that a source of carrying pollen grains from one flower to another are called as pollinators. So here are some examples of pollinators. Among pollinators or pollination, there are two types. One is insect pollination and the other one is wind pollination. In insect pollination, the flowers are brightly colored and the pollen grains of those flowers are sticky in nature. When these insects or birds or any other agent, they come in close contact to those pollen grains, so those pollen grains stick to their bodies. So when those insects or those animals, they visit another flower, there those pollen grains fall down on their stigmas. So this is an example of, you can see in this picture that with that insect, the bee body is fully covered by those yellow colored pollen grains. This is an example of wind pollination. Like in this picture, the plant is shown where there are so many dusty particles are thrown from that flower or from that structure of the plant. So this isn't a dust or smoke. These are all the pollen grains which are transferred with the help of the wind currents or air currents. So when air currents strike to these plants, the pollen grains, they move away from them and then they are carried too far away to other plants. The structures of a flower which are involved in the process of pollinations are anthers, which is the male part of the flower, and stigma, which is the female part of the flower. Anthers. In this diagram or picture, you can see the brick red colored structures. They are all anthers. Inside these anthers there are pollen grains. So the part of the flower which contains the male gametes called pollen grains is called as anthers. Pollen grains are minute microscopic structures which are produced inside the anthers, and when these pollen grains are released from the anther when they become mature. The structure of the pollen grains vary from flower to flower. Stigma. The top flattened part of the carpel, which is the female part of the flower, is called as stigma. In this picture you can see the greenish swollen part, the top region of this flower is known as stigma. Stigma is the part of the flower where pollen grains land. Like from the anther, when pollen grains are moved with the help of pollinators, they land on this part of the female part of the flower. Stigma is sticky in nature. As you can see in the picture, there is a liquid running from that stigma. This sticky liquid is produced by the stigma to catch or to attract pollen grains. When these pollen grains land on the stigma, then they are not able to, or they are unable to move away, or they are unable to fall down, because this sticky material or the sticky chemicals, it holds those pollen grains. Pollens and eggs. In these two pictures, there are two structures of the flowers are shown. The first one are the pollens. Inside the flower is the whole structure is shown, where the anther and the pollen grains are shown, and in the next diagram the microscopic picture of the pollen grains, in which there are some specialized structures, and these specialized structures are for the attachment with the pollinators. And in the next picture there is a ovary which is diploid or 2n in number, like full number of chromosome, and the enlarged picture of the ovule, in which the haploid cell are n, in which the half number of chromosome is contained, that is the egg cell. After landing on the stigma, the pollen start its journey towards the ovary or ovule. In the picture you can see there is a blue color tube originated from the pollen grain, that is known as the pollen tube. That pollen tube moves towards the ovary or towards the ovule for the purpose of fertilizing the egg. This is done by the formation of the pollen tube, which lead the pollen to the ovule. The ovule is the part where eggs are found. Fertilization. When the pollen tube reaches to the ovule, there the fusion of the male gamete and the female gametes occur. So the fusion of male and female gamete is called as fertilization. When the pollen reaches to the ovule, it fuses with the female gamete called as egg. Both the gamete, when unite to or fuse together, they form a new cell called as the zygote. Zygote is a cell which contains the DNA of both parents, like the DNA of the male parent and the DNA of the female parent. The zygote then develops to form a mass of cells called as embryo. Embryo is then enclosed in a structure called as seed. Seed. A seed is an embryonic plant enclosed in a protective outer covering. Seed are the product of the ripened ovule after fertilization by pollens and some growth within the mother plant. The mother plant means those plants in which fertilization occurs. The embryo is developed from the zygote and the seed coat from the integument. Integument means the skin of the ovule. Here you can see the structure of a seed. The outer covering is called as the testa. A hilum is the part where seeds are attached to the ovary wall. Micropyle is the opening from where those seeds get some water during germination or when they are sown. And in the lower diagram picture you can see the cross section of a seed, where you can see plumule and radicle. Plumule and radicle, they both give birth to the future roots and the future leaves. And cotyledons are there. Cotyledons are the structures which provide nourishment or food to the plant. Thank you.